Volkswagen Caddy with 154,000 kilometers. It's got a timing chain rattle. It is a 1.2 TSI engine. So we'll start it up now. Now this was only a mildly cold engine, it wasn't completely cold. So we're going to start by pulling these hoses out of the way so we can get the top cover off, undo this clip, move the hoses to one side, and then we'll start undoing these T30 bolts holding the top timing cover on. So I use a paint scraper to just break the seal. Once I've got that seal, I can then start sliding it down there to cut the silicone open. It's a little bit fiddly, this cover, especially doing it one-handed with the camera in hand. But once it's the silicone's broken, then you can slide it out of place and reveal the top of the timing chain. So you can see there where the silicone would be. We'll have to clean this off. So now we can see the chain, and the tensioner is sticking out quite a fair way. If we look down there next to the orange, which is the guide, we can see the tensioner piston sticking out. Now this is in a new tensioner, for an example. Compare that to this and you can see the difference. So this tensioner is overextended, and that is due to a stretched chain. So I've detensioned and removed the belt because we're going to be taking the crank pulley off. Next we're going to have to get this wheel arch liner out. It's held on with a load of T25 screws all the way around. And this will give us access to that front crank pulley and do our lower timing chain cover. Now you can see the crank pulley. You can see back here is where we'll be putting our timing tool in. I've just got the spanner on the tensioner holding it out of the way. And these are the bolts for the timing cover. We'll get the sump off also. You can see those Allen bolts. So I'll undo the sump plug now and drop the oil. Someone's put some silicone on this by the looks of it. We'll get this coolant pipe out of the way, a couple of 10 mils, and then we'll go onto the sump bolts. And then we're going to need to get this plate out of the way because some of the sump bolts are up inside the bell housing for the gearbox. As you can see, we can't get to them yet. And we'll get the level sensor off. So I've got that plate out of the way. Now we can get to these Allen key bolts up in the bell housing. So we'll go around and get all the ones around the sump now, and then we're going to undo these exhaust bolts. So we've got that exhaust down, and I've also unbolted it from the subframe. Got all the bolts out the sump. Now we use the paint scraper again to get the sump off. So inside the sump you can see oil is quite dirty, and I don't know if it's showing up well on the camera, but when we wipe our finger through it, it's quite sludgy and grey, which is a sign of there being wear from internal components, etc. So this car's definitely had lack of oil changes, or not enough oil changes. This is the reason why these timing chains do fail. And also in the pickup we can see a bit of debris as well, so we're going to have to clean that all off before we reassemble. Just tiny little orange pieces of silicone or something in there. So we've got the sump all off, and we're obviously going to clean out the oil pickup. But we also need to inspect this oil pump chain, and look how loose this is. That should not be hitting the housing like that. If we were to just do a timing chain on this and not do this oil pump chain, we would have another noise. And we'd be going in here again to redo this job. So we'll get the bottom cover off, all these 8mm 12-point bolts, and we'll slip the cover over the front of the crank here. So just look how dirty inside this engine it is. As you can see all that carbon build up. This engine will need a good oil flush. So I'm just going to take this idler pulley off, get that out of the way. Now I can get to all these bolts a lot more easily now. So we've got all those bolts out, and I've got the timing cover loose, so we'll get that off. Now we can see our timing chain. Now that gap between the two guides, we'll note that. There's no movement that I can feel there. Look, I can only get one finger in between the gap. Just about squeeze a thumb. So yeah, we'll compare that when we put the new chain on. So we can undo this T30 bolt and take this breather out. And this is the timing tool set. I'm going to be using this one in the cam. And that bolt's in place where that breather goes. So that breather out of the way, we can now look into the back of the camshaft and just see the slots. Now with the tool in place, I'm using that existing bolt. I'll take this Allen key bolt out at the bottom of the block. We use our bolt from our timing tool kit. Wind that in until it touches the crankshaft. We need to bottom this bolt out though. So it's touched the crank, there's still a gap. So we need to wind the engine. We need to turn it back a bit. And then we'll be able to wind the tool in. So with that wound in, the engine and the crank is now at easy.
Me?
Where I've wound that engine back a little bit, we can just see how much slack has ended up in the drive side of the chain. Obviously you shouldn't turn an engine backwards normally, but we are about to take this chain off. But when your engine stops, it will roll back a little bit, and this is why a chain can jump. So we're going to undo the top bolt on the cam now. Put our counter hold tool into the sprocket, so we're not relying on the timing tool itself. I've cracked that loose with a 16mm ratchet. Now I can't pop the sprocket off because I need to get this tensioner down here loose. It's a 27mm. So I've got that tensioner out and a rag down there to catch the oil. Now we'll wind the bolt completely out and we should be able to pull the sprocket off. A nice piece of silicone that's angled down from the top timing cover. So we just pull the chain off with the sprocket and then we can drop the chain down through the case. So we'll drop the chain down through and now we can get it out from underneath. We'll take these guides off. These are M8 splines. They are quite tight for little bolts. I'm using a 4-inch ratchet here. Now I've taken the cover off the oil pump pulley. You can see how loose that chain is on the sprocket, and the chain even rattles backwards and forwards. So we undo that centre bolt and we'll take that all off. So I've cracked that bolt loose, and then we'll just spin that out. Then that will allow us to remove the pulley from the oil pump and take the chain off the crank then. And it simply just pulls forwards. So I've got my old tensioner here on the left and the new one that's been supplied, and they're completely different. So it turns out that there is two different variants for the 1.2 TSI. So just make sure you get the right one for your build date. There is a difference massively with these lengths of tensioners, and the chain is also different, and it will not fit onto the original sprockets. So I've got the new oil pump chain installed, and you can see the slack. The slack just isn't as much, and it does not touch this case anymore. So there's now a gap when I swing the chain, and it feels tighter. So just going to slide the guides in. I'm just sliding them in and then putting a bolt in finger tight, just so I can get it to support the chain where I want it to, and then I'll tighten them up to the spec that they need to be. I've got a little bit of thread lock on them as well. And go ahead and tighten them down to 18 Newton meters. Now I'm going to tighten the tensioner down. It's with a new washer. I'm going to tighten this down to 60 Newton meters. Now we're going to do 50 Newton meters on the centre bolt for the cam, and I am holding the cam sprocket with the counterhold tool again while I torque it. It is important to use the counterhold tool so we don't put tension on the timing tool on the other end of the cam, and we're only going to do the Newton meters stage here. We're not going to stretch the bolt until we have checked the timing, so we'll crank the engine over, check the timing, and if it's correct we'll then stretch the bolt. I'm just going to take the timing tool out, and the one out of the crank also I've taken out from down the back. Now I've got a spanner on the crank. I'm just going to turn the engine over twice on the crank. Once it will turn on the cam, we'll just recheck our timing position. If you feel anything stop at this point, then you may need to check your timing again, as that may indicate that you're touching valves with pistons also. As you can see, this is turning nicely. So we'll recheck where the cam is now. You can see that we aren't anywhere near our alignment point, so we still need to rotate this engine round more. Probably another quarter turn on the camshaft. So we'll check again, and we might be able to put our tool in and just zero it in. Our tool is now in the cam, and we'll just turn the crank now and get it to line up with that bolt hole. I'm going to put the tool back in the crank lock, and I can reach around the bottom like this and screw it in. turn the crank right up to the crank stop, and we'll see if the cam tool lines up with the bolt hole. Slowly bringing it forwards, and there we've hit the crank stop. So we'll just check now, and if you can see, the bolt hole lines perfectly up with the threads. And we'll put the bolt back in and just verify that our timing is correct. So we'll tighten that bolt back up. Again, just knit back up just so we can make sure that timing tool doesn't slip out while we do our stretch of that bolt. Not that we're going to be using this as our holding tool, we're just holding the camshaft and not the sprocket. We're just going to tighten the sprocket. So we'll tighten this bolt, do our 90 degrees. So we've got a counter hold tool on there. And now I'm just going to stretch it 90 degrees while supporting the sprocket. You can do this with a paint marker and just mark the start and end point. There we go. So it came out about 110 newton meters. We're just going to do 5 newton meters on the Torx 30 bolts just to seat it. There is a pattern that we've got to do it in, so we start from the bottom and work our way up in a diagonal format. And then after we've done that first 5 newton meters, seating it, we're going to go up to 8 newton meters, and we'll just work from the bottom up again, and then do the top 2 bolts last. So we'll do these bottom ones, work from the middle out. And then we'll do the next ones up. That guy here, and this one down here. And then we'll do this one and this one at the top. So we're basically working across, up, and then up again. So you can see now the clearance is greater. Clean the inside of the timing cover, and we're just going to put some sealant on it now. Timing cover is on and the bolts are all tightened up. I'm going to put our crank seal in with the crank form tool. Just tap that all the rest of the way in. And now I've got my pulley all back on with the crank bolt tightened up to 150 newton meters plus 180 degrees with the counter hold tool so we can do the angle. All the belts on, and we've got our coolant pipe bolted on, and our sump is also back on. And you can see the bead of silicone. So we'll put some oil in and be ready to fire it up.